I'm ready. Not that I'm aware of. I don't see Becky back there, so maybe. Oh, Becky's right there.
Brendan's already live, but when you're ready, we're going to turn you on.
Okay. Turn me on.
Turn around. Ready, go.
Now? Okay. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I'm Sage Cole, and this is Tuesday, August 9th, 2022. It's 9 a.m., and I'm getting ready to offer my second lecture. The Bible is Us. Angels, dreams, and visions are for everyone. So I mentioned him yesterday briefly in my lecture, but George has been on my mind and heart. I wonder, has he been on anybody else's mind and heart as of late? It's not really much of a surprise, as he only recently transitioned into the spiritual world. Some of you may know that Helen Keller often, welcome. Helen Keller often would remark, well, maybe not often, but she remarked that she believed that after she died, she would have an even greater impact on the world because she would be free to travel at will and impact who she wanted, and was kind of excited to be able to continue to improve the lives of the disabled, bring about economic justice, create the world as she wished it would be after she died and resided on the other side of the veil. And I've been thinking about that and George. If you think about all of his accomplishments during his lifetime, the people that he loved, the places that his mind and his heart were able to go, and the understanding that he was able to bring back and share with all of us. The ways we understand and the depth of our love, for many of us, I'm sure, have been changed and impacted by George. And I wonder if he might now be offering us even more, whispering to us in our dreams and in our daily wanderings, passionately trying to convey to us how much more he has learned and seen since entering into the fullness of his spiritual body. George's ideas come to me on the regular, and they're often coupled with him, his smile, a laugh, a joke, something of his physical person, because it was his whole person that we were all really blessed to experience. And of course, now there are quite a few actual embodied humans who are here on this earth because of George, who continue to embody his gifts, his struggles, his bit of humanness. And while he affected the world in a myriad of personal ways, it was his calling as a minister in the Church of the New Jerusalem, in our church, where he offered really his most passionate and devoted self. He committed his entire life to seeking to understand and to live out this call of the new church. So as I struggle to determine what's next in my call to serve this new church, I can't help but believe it's important to really consider George and his legacy as sort of the most recently departed saint of our tradition. And so in preparing for my talk today, it was this little book that really inspired much of what I want to share. Do any of you have this on your bookshelf? A few? Good. Does it get lost on your bookshelf because it's so little? This tiny little book, a book about us, the Bible and stages of our lives, this unassuming book, kind of like George, very unassuming, is an outline of his Swedenborgian biblical hermeneutic, which in non-theologianese is, these are the primary essays that describe how George read the inner sense of the Bible, as outlined in Swedenborg's writings. I remember when this book was first published, And I was speaking to the Reverend Andy Stinson, and I remember, as if you know Andy, his passionate fury about the way this was published. He wanted this to be gold embossed with red, a thick red cover, like the little copies of the New Jerusalem and its heavenly doctrines that we get placed in our hands when we're ordained. He thought, how could this treasure of his work, be so easily lost on your bookshelf? Because he really could see, as I think many of us who studied with George, how important his contribution was to our tradition. Now, not to say that George is the next Swedenborg, but he is and was one among many in a lineage of our tradition. And as I suggest, as one who was recently departed, maybe someone who really deserves a little bit extra time to consider what he shared with us. For me, George helped to really put the pieces of the inner sense together in the biblical story in a way that gave it form and meaning, that almost enfleshed the inner sense, far beyond anything I was individually able to grasp in my direct readings of Swedenborg. Everything George shared comes, first and foremost from Swedenborg. He was a theologian and a devoted reader, but he pulled out a gem through his teaching and scholarship, storytelling. He pulled out this gem from within Swedenborg's writings that I don't know if we would have seen without his efforts. We might have missed it, or potentially misconstrued it. Page 4, thank goodness, okay. Without George's efforts. The Bible is a book about us. It's a book about us and the stages of our lives. It's a book about me, it's a book about you, it's a book about Theo and Zach and all the other people here at camp, and all the people on the street and all the people everywhere. And maybe even a book about the journey of life itself, that we all share in a particular way as humans, but that we also share in a particular way as just life and created life. I like to think about the Bible like a stained glass window. Anyone who looks into it will see something of their reflection, but in a new light, in a divine light. Everyone doesn't have to look. That divine light in them will always be there even if they don't look in the stained glass. But if they choose to look into it, they will see something new. What George helped to lift out is that the Bible speaks to us as a full and complete narrative of the human lifespan, a lifespan that is always in motion. We like to think of ourselves as solid creatures that have a definitive stance, identity, but we are all constantly in motion. And George really helped to lift that motion out in the biblical narrative so that we can see each stage of our lives depicted in this journey from the Garden of Eden, the simplicity and the direct connection to God that we're born with, all the way up to that holy city that we talked about yesterday. George, he loved. Robert Keegan was his human development guru who he had us all read in seminary. And he studied the process of human development, and he made connections to that process in the biblical story. Those early stories in the book of Genesis are so dramatic, just like our dramatic toddlers and small children. Noah's Ark and the Garden of Eden, the Tower of Babel. This kind of everything is the best and everything is the worst, which so much is of how childhood is experienced. And then we move into the patriarchs and sort of the dutiful following, that beginning of starting to etch out that we may have a particular identity. And we say, yeah, we just say yes, and we just keep moving forward, like Abraham and his sons. Until we find ourselves somehow enslaved in the city of Egypt, we begin to see how we are so caught up in the expectations of some inner voice that is not allowing us to be free. Until finally we are freed, only to then wander in the wilderness. I remember speaking with George in my biblical class a lot about the prophets and the call of the prophets, and he would often talk about that's sort of like that middle-aged time when you're up at the top of the bell curve and you're being called to this bigger life, this higher life, and it's painful and it's hard. And yet it's leading to, hopefully, this foolish baby being born into the world. This opportunity to relinquish this constant journey for the promised land, my promised land, to relinquish it for just the fullness and the joy of being alive. The constant measuring and failing to measure up that I spoke about yesterday is replaced by the birth of Jesus, by God in humanity. God not as that demanding Father in the sky saying, prove yourself, find your promised land, but now God in Jesus, this fleshy, breakable, lovable human, just like you and me. I feel like George, I don't know if he knew it, but I feel like he revealed some of the fleshiness in the Bible. And helped me personally to see the gift of the Bible as an opportunity to ground myself in my own story. One of the real pitfalls of being a human is finding ourselves in a part of our story where there feels like there is no escape, or we feel like we have lost our way. And there is no greater tragedy than any of us, any human person, feeling that sense of no hope, no way forward. And yet we find those stories all through the Bible. And so in grounding ourselves in the Bible and saying, okay, maybe this is the stage I'm in and this is the journey that I'm going through, we have the gift of being able to see what we've maybe come through already and what may be lying ahead. I think George was offering us something in our lineage as a tradition that really may be helping us to move into the next level of who we are called to be. I certainly know that when I talk about the fleshiness of Jesus, when I talk about the Bible as a story about us and Jesus' journey as a human in-fleshed being coming divine, I don't know, do any of you feel a little bit of nervousness? Does that make you nervous to talk about the fleshy Jesus? I wonder, I mean, I wasn't raised in the church as a small child. I came to Christianity later on. But I wonder if I carry around a little bit of PTSD from like the religious wars of the past. Because when I think about Jesus' flesh, when I really try to think about Jesus as just like me, I get a little nervous that there's something a little bit heretical here. That thinking about Jesus' flesh too much, thinking about the Bible as a story about us, as about my flesh, that somehow taints the holiness that we have been trained to keep certainly the Bible in and certainly our Lord Jesus in. That the church has sought to transcend in so much of its imaging where in this the natural level and raise it up to the divine. But at the same time that talking about Jesus' flesh or the embodiment of the Bible as us makes me nervous, it also makes me pretty excited. I think there's a liberative possibility that opens up when we talk about the Bible as us and when we talk about Jesus and his humanity. Imagine our own lives as just as sacred, just as powerful and turbulent of a process and a journey as the divine book that we honor and we read from, and as the divine man who we look to for transformation and rebirth. The people in the Bible and Jesus went through all of the same struggles. They had the same desires for control and need to belong, probably experiences of rejection and being lost. And at the same time, the Bible continues, the story always continues, no matter how hard the challenges are. And Jesus' story continues, even through crucifixion and death. Now, this week we're talking about angels, visions, and dreams. And so I'm not specifically naming those qualities, but those are three aspects of the story of the Bible that are also three aspects of the story of all of our lives. Most of us have dreams. Many of us, I know, have had the experience of being visited or informed or touched or helped by some being beyond this realm. And perhaps even many of us have had visions that have guided our way. In thinking about the Bible as a book about us and the stages of our life and lifting that up, we're called to honor the experiences that we also have that often don't look that different from the dramatic episodes of the biblical story. The Bible, the story of us, we can use the Bible to find ourselves. We can also understand that the Bible at its core is conveying a message that's similar to the message that's being conveyed in our own life journey. Our stories are different than the stories of the Bible on an external level. But what Swedenborg often is encouraging us to consider is that on an internal level, the stories are quite the same. He writes about how celestial angels, when they read the word, they don't hear about Joseph and the technicolor coat. They don't hear about the Exodus. They don't hear the names of the places, but they just experience the states that those names and places are seeking to elicit. They connect to that deeper, more fundamental story that isn't contingent on which biblical translation you're using or how the approach that you're taking to the reading. They know what is true at the most ultimate level. So it feels to me not that hard of a stretch to imagine that most ultimate level, as much as my story is quite different than the stories in the Bible, but that on a most ultimate level, a similar movement is happening, because I am connected to that divine source, just like all of you. And so this is where I feel called to really consider what George has offered, to keep listening to what his message might be for us. You know, he, like Swedenborg, was so smart and so diligent and such a devoted studier of the scripture. And as I shared, brought down these jewels. And yet also was a humble man and would never say that he had the final answer or the final say. And would often say, especially towards the end of his life, that, okay, I've written a lot of great things, but the truth is I can't really understand any of this if my heart isn't in the right place. People in the Bible, what makes the Bible a sacred text to me is that the people in the Bible are journeying with God and telling the story of their journey with God. Their story of challenge, of insight, of despair, and of hope. And this is the Word made flesh. And what I might suggest, what I'm beginning to wonder about and consider in terms of my contribution to this lineage of our church, is how we are adding to that divine story. How our lives and our stories of dreams and angels and visions are a part of this larger work of the Word made flesh. God calls everyone because we're all plugged into the same power source, this power source of divine providence that is drawing all life in a direction that we actually have a little bit better understanding of since all of the scientific developments of the last 300 years, a direction towards expansion and greater diversity. As I mentioned yesterday, things in the world on an external level right now appear somewhat bleak to many of us. It can feel chaotic and uncertain. But one of the things that gives me hope is the expansion, the diversity of stories that exist in the world at this moment as compared to, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 300 years ago. The amount of stories, the amount of humans who are willingly sharing their stories, speaking their truth is erupting, it's exploding on a huge scale. Now, of course, this can also make us feel stressed out. It feels simpler and easier to have one story to follow. I certainly feel stressed out with the amount of YouTube my children watch. But I had an experience recently of watching my younger son watching a makeup tutorial of like this really awkward middle school girl. And I was like, okay, it's all worth it. Like if she can tell her story, there's a lot of ugly stories out of there. There's a lot of messy ones. There's a lot of ones that seem to have no plot and make no sense. But there's also this growing freedom and there's this growing confidence, I think, and also growing technology and resources for us to tell our stories. I wonder if this is a part of the Word being made flesh, of us starting to see the way in which each of us has that divine spark and our stories are worthwhile. I believe that we might possibly be on the cusp of unleashing another level of diversity and creativity that we as of yet cannot imagine. Right now, we have LGBTQ people sort of doing new things and trying stuff, and we're like, that's weird and that's different. But what if that's just the beginning? What if there are levels of creativity and expression that once we can shed some of the ideas about how we should be and how we should look and what it takes to belong, if we truly were able to encounter each other as unique individuals and love each other not based on how much you were like me, but on how much you were fully yourself, I don't know. To me, that's exciting. The possibility of our diversity moving even beyond anything that we can imagine. And that diversity is what we spoke about yesterday, is what is really called for, in my mind, in the vision of the Holy City, where we shed some of the strictures of the past and come into more full relationship with the present. George, he brought himself to his writing. He didn't really write these didactic theological opuses. He wrote stories about himself and his family, about some of you. And in that way, he was in line with the tradition that is emerging even more now of speaking from our experience. There's no longer we no longer get to be a Swedenborg where we just speak the truth and we don't get to say where we come from or how this connects to our lives. We now have to speak from our own experience. There's this wonderful new, the librarian, Nancy, narrative nonfiction. It's this wonderful new class of writing where people are writing nonfiction, they're writing the truth, but they're writing it through narrative and through story and through their own experience. How much more honest and real and accessible this kind of writing is. And George sort of did that a little bit. He told stories, he was himself, and I believe he offered us something in his kind of taking all of Swedenborg's writings about the Bible and putting it into this tiny little book, he gave us something, he gave us a tool, a way of thinking about this story as really ours. And I'm curious how we can do that more, how we can invite more people to see the holiness and the sacredness of their own story. My oldest son, Theo, recently, we have a magic 8-ball at our house, and it was bedtime, and he decided to ask the magic 8-ball if God existed. I honestly don't remember what the answer was, but I thought it really is kind of stuck in me, like that the image of God that he has with 2 clergy parents is so defined and finite that he could ask this question in a yes or no fashion. How are we telling the story of God to make it that concrete that it could be true or it could be false? How can we do a better job of telling that story so that our children are growing up with a sort of innate belief that their story is sacred and divine and meaningful, that that's not something to question? I believe that may be the next level of our evolution as a species. To take that for granted, because when we believe that God is one and that we are all in this together, then we all are sacred and we must treat each other as such. When we can acknowledge that sacred nature of ourselves, then when we are in the pit of despair or when we feel that we have lost our way, we see that others have been there too before us and that there will be a way out. That losing of our way could actually be an opportunity to finding our way. That's the message that I'm hoping to bring, and I think our tradition has to offer. The Bible is a book about us, the stages of our lives. It is not prescriptive to tell us what to do and how to always have it right, but it is descriptive of the human journey that we are all messily partaking in. So I pray that more and more stories are told, that more and more of us are willing to tell our stories honestly about our own experiences of the spiritual life. Because I don't know if the future of the church will be a continued journey with this one story, but maybe it will be a continued journey with the Word made flesh in all of our stories. These are my questions, and I'm glad to be asking them with all of you. I'll leave it there. I'm happy to hear your questions and comments. Sure, if you guys are okay.
This is Nancy. We do have a copy. Actually, now we have 2 of that book.
Yeah.
And the reason that we have 2 is because I couldn't remember that I had it. And so I bought a second copy. Mm-hmm. And then, well, actually, I should say it wasn't on the shelf where it should be, under G, you know. Mm-hmm. And so, so what happened was I found it, but it was tucked inside another book.
Oh, interesting.
And that's because of the size. I think Andy's right.
Yeah.
And so it was tucked inside of another George Joel book. Uh-huh. And it was, it's not over here, but it's the Pilgrim's Passage to Hell.
Yep.
Is that the title?
Something like that.
Something like that. Anyway, Journey.
Yeah.
Something like. Anyway, so my copy of A Book About Us was hiding in another George Joel book.
About hell.
About hell.
Yeah. Thanks, Nancy. Allison got this for me, thankfully, from FNCA, so I hope there would be one here.
This is Susanna. I just want to comment because you mentioned about being on the top of the bell curve, and George was famous for saying that once you're over the hill, you pick up speed.
Yeah.
And he certainly did in his life.
He certainly did, yeah. I only knew him when he was on his way down and out and up.
Susanna and I were at Temenos Retreat Center for 10 years, and the foundation, the Swedenborg Foundation, came down 3 times a year. So I was catering for them for over 10 years. And after the first year, George was there all the time, and he would observe me, and he didn't say much. But then one day he said, "Why don't you come sit down?" After I had all the food out, he said, "Why don't you come sit down and talk with us?" And I couldn't bring myself to do that. I was too caught up in the worry of where's the food, what's going on, who's going to get dessert, what's the fire doing? And that was like 20 years ago. I mean, we've been out of there for quite a while, and it still sits with me. And when we had our memorial service for George last year, he said, "You got to stop worrying, Dean. It does no good."
You know, he's still talking to all of us. I could share one more thing, because you mentioned about his work in the next world, and I heard from Sarah that his last words, or close to his last words, were, "I can't wait to run again," because he was a runner and he hadn't been able to do that for a while. So I know he's finding his joy in heaven.
Okay.
I don't want us to leave. It's so nice to honor George and
Yeah.
hear again about how much he's given to all of us and to the future.
Okay, while other people are getting warmed up, thank you, Sage. So, speaking about George Dole and your reference to Robert Keegan, I'll say a word or two about what I also heard in this light. So George was attracted to Robert Keegan, who, by the way, was an active colleague on Harvard's faculty, and then later at a school of psychology. He may have sort of founded in the Boston area, but he was very active. He had students, Robert Keegan did, learning his way, which was about the self and evolution, or something like that. The evolution of the self. And it was about life, as actually Sage has very clearly stated, it was about life in the world. It was about life as we experience it growing up from childhood, so it's chronological. And the key insight that George, as I recall, found in Keegan was he called it the fundamental force of life, the nature of life itself from a developmental human point of view. And there were two dimensions to it. There was the need to be included, inclusion, and the need for autonomy. I'm pretty sure those are the two words, but those are the two ideas. So, and he felt that it was both. And actually, George would critique our goal for church growth, because that really emphasizes the need for inclusion, and we want people to belong to our church, and there are existential issues there, and they're real. But George would always say, but we also have to let them go to become themselves, and that needn't be let them go, leave our organization, which has an existential purpose for being in the world. It means that our way of being a spiritual community ought to include you're one of us, belong, and you're who you are becoming. You're becoming an autonomous agent with agency. So I'll just say this more about this. So George claimed that Robert Keegan would say that dynamic is the fundamental motion of life. That is the phrase. And that is the motion that exists from early years of childhood into all of the 5 or so stages of life, all the way to integrity of older age. So on that fundamental force of life, motion. It really, Keegan called it the motion of life, the need to be included and the need to individuate is actually even a better word. Now, George would connect that, by the way, as I'm going to wait for a hand to come up. Sage, raise your... Katie's waiting. Okay, great. Okay. So I'll finish with this, that George would connect that with our philosophy of, or our theological grounding idea, which would be love is the motion of life to belong and include and draw ones to, and wisdom is its complementary fundamental motion of life, one of which cannot exist without the other. Wisdom cannot exist without love, love cannot exist without wisdom, and he would conclude by saying inclusion cannot exist without the freedom of individuation, and individuation gets kind of scary without some form of inclusion. Oops.
Oh, thank you, Gard. That's well put. Thank you.
I just was thinking about the book's smallness and the size and the cover, and I thought, well, the first time I saw it, I really thought, oh, I can read that.
Yeah, there you go.
That's not too much.
Uh-huh.
And I think that George would have really liked the approachable. I hope he did like the approachability of that for anyone.
Yeah.
And it's also been a book that I could offer to someone that was very accessible to someone who was not in the church, who was curious. And I thought, well, this explains it better than anything else.
Yeah.
Plus, it reminds me of the works that Thich Nhat Hanh's publisher has put out that are very thin and small and many, but very easy and approachable to read.
I would also comment that given the attention span that we're developing in young humans right now, that's not too scary.
Yeah, we just need to make sure they don't get lost on the shelf. I think Eleanor has got,
Swedenborg does have a word for this fundamental life force, and that's anima, which is usually translated as soul, but literally is closer to the animating force. It's the same word that we use for animation, animate. It's the prime mover within consciousness, which then later becomes defined as love. And another thing that this talk brought up is that the difference between the Bible and the Word, and how Swedenborg himself kind of throws out large chunks of the Bible, and then in this larger kind of scriptural category of the Word includes things like the Quran and the ancient Word, and so he creates a scriptural canon that is very broad, and it leads me to think that maybe in kind of the development of society and the development of religious institutions, we have a built-in tendency to select for those stories that reflect in our own hearts and in our own consciousness. So that implies that the first scripture is something that's inside of us. That the first scripture, like he says, the most ancients had the word written on their hearts, because the heart is the first scripture, and breath is the first prayer. And I think that's such an important place to go, because it's not about, we're in the best book club. It's about, how does this reflect in your heart? But great talk, thank you.
Thanks, Eleanor.
Where'd they go?
Silence is okay. All right, thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Sage.